Hello and welcome back. It's been a while since I've made a video as I've been busy working on other projects, most notably my reunion with The Bugs, Canada's oldest ambient electronic music ensemble. But I was invited to Edmonton to participate in the Boreal Electroacoustic Music Society's NoiseFest. And so although noise isn't necessarily my genre of distinction, I was certainly excited to perform there live, as it had been a while and it looked like a stellar lineup of noise artists from all over Western Canada. So I put together this little rig and did a performance in Edmonton. I will release the video of the performance, but before I do that, I wanted to give you folks a chance to see what it was I created and how it is that it works. So let's get started. We'll take a brief look at what's in the case, what it does, and how I control it. So starting from left to right, I've got a Doepfer theremin antenna, and I've got another one on the far right side, and they control the two halves of the patch. So essentially what I've created is a stereo patch that has two sub-voices. Over here on the left, I've got a Doepfer A118 noise generator, and I'm using its two outs. And then as we move to the right, I've got a Doepfer Quad LFO that I'm using for panning, Doepfer VCF that I'm using as one of the voices. And then I've got the very interesting Doepfer voltage-controlled bit modifier, and you'll see it's a little weird looking because it's mounted in here upside down, simply because my little Moog case wouldn't let me fit it in any other way. And then I'm running a Doepfer dual voltage controlled crossfader, which if you set up the jumpers on the rear and plug it in correctly, you can create a voltage controlled panner with it. So that's what I'm doing. I'm using it for my first voice to do some panning. Then I've got a joystick that's here in the middle mounted upside down so I can get to the little stick. I'm using that to control. It's hidden all the way over here, but there's a happy nerding effects unit. And I'm using that as a reverb, and I've got it voltage controlled by the joystick. So one axis of the joystick controls the wet and dry signal, and the other controls the length of the reverb. And you'll see in my performance I use that to great effect. Then next to it, I've got a very interesting Delptronics Wii controller module. So it's the little Delptronics module. You may still be able to get these as kits. They're quite inexpensive, but it's really cool because it lets you use a regular Wii controller to output voltages from either the rotational axis of the Wii, the joystick that's on the top of it, or the two buttons. And for this patch, I'm just using the joystick and the two buttons, and I'll explain how in a minute. And then the heart of the patch is the new Doepfer A121S stereo multimode voltage controlled filter, and that I'm using for one of the voices. You can check out my video. I did, I think, a 4-video series, quite an in-depth look at this fantastic new filter. And then beside that, I've got an IntelliGel bifold, which I'm running in stereo mode. Some of you may not know that this IntelliGel bifold can be run as a single complex folder, or you can run it as two separate folders with distinctly different wave shaping kinds of sounds coming out of it. Next, I've got a little Doepfer manual switch that I'm using to turn on and off the two voices that I'll explain in a sec. And then I've got a Doepfer stereo panning mixer that I use to mix these two voices in stereo, send them through the effects, and then through a Pittsburgh output. I was very adamant that I wanted to create a stereo noise source, and was able to verify with the front of house folks at the venue that it was indeed a stereo sound system. So it worked to great effect. And in fact, I recorded the master that you'll hear in the finished video in stereo, as well as this demo. So if you've got headphones on, you'll hear some panning and things going on. So let's get into the voices. So the first voice that I created uses this little 121-3 miniature VCF as its sound source, and I'm coming out of the low pass out, so I get a sine wave out when the Q or the resonance is up loud enough, and then that goes into the dope for bit crushing effect. From there goes into the panner, and then from the panner goes into the mixer. So then if I flick on these switches, we'll hear that voice start to do something. So the voice is pulsing away, and essentially what we're listening to is the low frequency of the VCF functioning as an oscillator. The leftmost theremin antenna is patched in to that filter, so as I move closer to the antenna, I'm bringing up the frequency of that oscillator, that filter functioning as an oscillator. Now I'm modulating that filter. I'm modulating its frequency with noise that comes from my noise output. And there's two different types of noise I'm using. I'm using a colored noise, and I'm using the random sort of slower noise that you can get out of this very, very interesting low frequency random signal that comes out of this module. And it's dependent a little bit on how the colored noise is set. But I wanted to be able to crossfade between those two signals. So I've got Synthworks passive crossfader just bolted on the side of my case because I was running out of space, and that's basically crossfading between the colored output and the much slower random output. If I go to my filter and then I turn down control voltage 2, then I'm not sending any noise to the filter, and we're just listening to the sine wave. But of course we're not going to hear a sine wave because that sine wave output goes into the bit crusher. So that's the signal of the bit crusher. Now I'm using this top miniature joystick on my Delptronics Wii controller, and I've got one axis controlling one of the parameters on the dope for bit crusher, and the other axis controls the other. So one is going to control the sample rate, and one's going to control the bit depth. And I'm trying to hold my left hand steady as it's controlling the filter frequency, which is the oscillator driving the bit crusher. Now, if you've got headphones on, you can hear some slow panning. And that panning comes from the dope for crossfader. It's being driven by one of the LFOs from the dope for quad LFO. If I speed it up, then we'll hear our panning rate increase. So when I first thought about the idea of creating a little noise case to take to NoiseFest, what I really wanted to do was to maximize control over frequency, complexity of sound, volume, and also the kind of space that the sound was in. And so if you'll see, as I move the joystick more to the middle, you start to hear some of the happy nerding reverb. As I'm increasing reverb time and increasing the wetness of the effect. And if I push it all the way into the corner, I get this kind of rush of white noise that fades off, and I use that to great effect as a kind of a transition from one little bit of the performance to the next. So far I'm just using this one antenna. I'm modulating the frequency of the filter, and then I'm modulating that output with the bit crusher and changing it with the joystick. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in, by bringing up control voltage 2 again, some of the noise that also modulates the frequency of the filter. Well, I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this quick look at my noise patch. In the next section, we'll take a look at the second voice of my noise patch. Take care, and we'll see you next time.